So let's now move on to God as a poor designer. And there's loads of stuff we can talk about in this area. So let's talk about Adam and Eve to begin with. Now, remember, we're believing here in this idea of an omni-God that has full divine foreknowledge. So God knows ahead of the game exactly what will happen. Everything. Oh, am I still there?
Yeah, I'm trying. Okay. It keeps glitching. 1 second.
Okay, I'll. Yay! I exist.
Keeps glitching on me today.
Sorry. So Adam and Eve, if God knows in advance exactly what's going to happen with everything that is created, let's have a look at Adam and Eve. So God creates Adam and Eve, fully knowing that they are going to make the wrong choice in the Garden of Eden, yet creates them anyway. In other words, God can't get angry with what happens in the Garden of Eden because God knows that that's going to happen and creates anyway. So that's an interesting thing. But also, the whole story really doesn't make any sense because they have not eaten from the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, right? So they have no moral knowledge. God says, don't eat from that tree. Hang on. So if they break that rule, they're not doing a moral bad because they have no knowledge of morality. So the whole story is back to front. It doesn't make any sense. That's because it's just a myth, right? It is obviously just a myth. But if you believe in Adam and Eve literally, then this story doesn't make sense. So God says, don't eat from the tree. And they're like, basically, they're looking and saying, the command, don't eat from the tree, is just a neutral, kind of almost meaningless thing. All it is like, well, don't do that. Yeah, but it doesn't matter if I do. There's no mattering. There's no moral mattering because I have no knowledge of good and evil. Then they eat from the tree after being tempted by the serpent. And then God gets angry with them and kicks them out of the Garden of Eden. But A, they didn't have any moral knowledge. B, you designed them in such a way that you knew they would do that and they did it anyway. You could have designed them differently, but you didn't. So therefore, this is on you, God. This is on you that they did that. So you can't punish them, really, or you can, but it's completely unfair. So does that make sense so far?
Oh, yeah. And remember, he kicks them out as well in fear of them eating from the other tree so they become like him.
Yeah. You know, he has fear. Actually, there's a plural use there as well because it's like us. I think it's, you know, there's this pantheon of gods, of course, and this
Elohim in Hebrew is a plural anyway.
Exactly. So, but the other problem is a two-horn dilemma for the Adam and Eve story, and the two-horn dilemma is this, right? So imagine Adam and Eve. So Adam and Eve have to kind of like pass this test or fail. They fail the test, right? And then God punishes us. There's a fall. So we are all fallen and we are all punished in a way as a result of what Adam and Eve did. Right. So that is fair only if Adam and Eve are representative of us. What that means is that if I ask you, Hanney, if you were put down in the Garden of Eden and God said the same thing to you, then the idea of them being representative of us is the fact that you would also do that. In fact, all of us would have failed that test and would have disobeyed God. All of us would have done that. And so therefore, by God testing all of humanity by using Adam and Eve, that is representative, right? So that is kind of fair. The problem is it makes God look like a really horrible designer because he's designed all of us in such a way that we would fail the very first test he's given us. And
Jonathan, if God's divine foreknowledge includes the crucifixion of Jesus and the betrayal of Judas Iscariot, Adam and Eve must eat from the tree. Yeah. They have to. Otherwise, that foreknowledge won't be fulfilled.
So, well, you can talk about problem of evil here, which is really interesting. I don't think I've applied the problem of evil to Adam and Eve before. I might have done. My memory is not so good these days. So the idea is that any evil or suffering must beget a greater good. Because, you know, there can be no such thing as gratuitous suffering. This is part of God's omni characteristics, right? If God is all loving, there can be no gratuitous suffering. So in other words, that Adam and Eve did that thing is actually ultimately good. It's ultimately good that they did that because of what comes along later. So yeah, it becomes like kind of crazy. Any evil there can be. The problem is that you look at all evil and you can't whinge about it because there's no such thing as a tragedy. It all has to happen to bring about a greater good.
And it proposes a very, very kind of, I think it's quite promiscuous and evil narrative here, that God has a story. It's like he's a novelist. And he wrote a full story all the way to the end. And we're there, the characters of that story. We're acting out our roles. You've got to do them, otherwise the novel won't end.
Yeah, but of course, if you know all these things, and what's the point of doing this? Especially if by doing it, you are necessarily committing people to suffering. So I just want to get back to the two horn dilemma. So the one horn dilemma is that Adam and Eve are representative of all humanity. So you would have made that same decision, Hanney, and that's fair. But it makes God look like a very poor designer. So he's designed all of humanity to fail. The other horn of the dilemma is that if Adam and Eve did that, but they're not representative of humanity. So if Hanney was in the Garden of Eden, you would have actually said, no, I'm not going to eat that. I'm not going to eat that fruit. Thank you very much. And serpent, you can go and do one. I'm going to listen to God. Then what that means is that God is punishing us on behalf of a non-representative sample of his creation, which is deeply, deeply unfair. So we are all being punished with original sin on account of the decision of people that are completely unconnected to us. So God is completely unfair. So you have the two horns of this dilemma are that one, God is an absolutely terrible designer, or two, God is unfair. And there doesn't seem to be any way out of this, because God is creating humans in order that they suffer on account of what Adam and Eve did, and he designed them in such a way to do that.
Of course, yeah. And when you think about it, it was the woman who ate from the fruit first, and then give her man, and the creation of a woman from the rib of man was kind of an afterthought anyway. But if the women weren't created, because that was a possibility, and reproduction might have just been through a slightly different mechanism, then you could have argued that might have never happened in the first place. But everything that God does lead to the inevitable.
Yeah. Well, yeah, because you've got to remember that God knows everything's going to happen, and so this is all just a set of dominoes that's taking place, because God has divine foreknowledge of every single counterfactual, of every single event that's going to take place on this universe.
But this is where some Christians start to apologize. You're saying, well, divine foreknowledge doesn't mean necessarily the planning of the actual action. God knows what you're going to do, but because of free will, he cannot intervene. And he knows what you're going to be choosing.
Okay, so that's just like, yeah. So this is, I disagree with this argument. So I would present something called the grounding objection to this, which is to say that, so this is the idea that it's kind of like, I'm going to watch a DVD. I'm going to watch people don't use DVDs anymore. I'm going to watch a film now, and it's going to play out in front of me, but I don't make it play out like that. But the problem is that God, that's a bad analogy, because God has literally designed everything and created everything and has ultimate responsibility over it so that it happens in that way. So the problem is God has all these infinite array of possible worlds he could create, and chose and created this one, right? So it could have happened in other ways, but it didn't, because God chose this one and knew all the eventualities and chose this one and designed the universe in such a way that it would happen in this way, and he knew it would happen in this way and chose it this way. So I think that's a real problem. But the grounding objection says that if say at 2:00 on a next Tuesday afternoon, you're going to make a cup of tea, right? And God knows that indubitably, then if you were put in a slightly different situation, you wouldn't have decided to make a cup of tea. Then there must be something that grounds your decision to make a cup of tea within that first causal circumstance. This is called a grounding objection. I don't want to go too much into this, but the idea is that there must be something that grounds all of our decisions to do things in certain situations, and therefore the fact that you can't just let God off the hook with the whole free will argument, because he knows what's going to happen and has designed and created the causal circumstances in which we decide all the things that we decide.
Jonathan, I urge you to watch this movie. It's written here. It's called Mother. If you haven't seen it before, you got to see this one here.
Is that the one with Nicole Kidman?
No, that's Jennifer Lawrence and Javier Bardem. Right. This is theology. This is a genius, and it talks about because God keeps creating, and the whole thing collapses and gets destroyed, And at the end of the movie, Javier Bardem plays God. And I want to kill it for you because a lot of people watched this movie and they thought it was a horror movie. They did not get the biblical, because it's there's a lot of allegories in the movie. So if you're not biblically smart, you'll think it's a horror movie. They play Jesus. They play the entire creation. And Javier Bardem, the husband, is God. And Jennifer Lawrence plays nature, and he needs nature to keep creating. But she complains because he keeps destroying nature. And at the very end, she asked God, why do you keep doing that? He said, and he was quite apologetic, he said, I'm very sorry, it's in my nature. So it's almost like God's ontology. He's compelled to create.
This is one of the later arguments in the book, right? Which we'll come to, which is if God knows his own future freely will, well, if God knows his own future events, his own actions and events, then God is constrained by his own nature. God is on a railroad track and cannot have any free will. God has to do there. God is the most non-free will entity that you can ever imagine. But we'll get onto that. That's a later one. Just a couple of analogies I want to bring in on the kind of design front here. That imagine you, Hanney, you're an amazing scientist in a lab, and you create a sentient life form out of test tubes. You're creating basically out of nothing. You're creating these sentient life forms. Now, at the design, you're at the table at the design stage. You're like, I know 100% these life forms are going to go out into the town and they're going to rape and pillage and kill. They're going to cause right problems. Some of them will do some nice things, maybe give to charity and do some nice stuff. But basically, these life forms are going to go out and cause mayhem. So I'm designing them, and that's what they're going to do. I know that, and I create them anyway. I know 100% what they're going to do. I am responsible for bringing them into existence such that they do that. And if I didn't do this, they wouldn't do that. So you do this and you create these life forms and you design them in such a way that they go out and do all this stuff, right? And they're raping and pillaging in the village. Now, I would expect the police to come to your door as this scientist and say, we hold you, even though they freely did what they did, we hold you at least somewhat morally culpable for the actions that took place out there, because you knew 100% that was going to happen and you did it anyway. Does that make sense as an analogy?
Even in the legal system, sometimes the inciter of a crime can take actually higher degree of punishment than the perpetrator themselves, because they were able to manipulate a person into the person becomes just a tool.
Yeah. So imagine this. So there's a second analogy here, that you are both a designer and a CEO of a car company, right? So you sat at your table again, you design this car and you think, right, I know this car is going to break down quite often and will veer off the road and will kill its passengers or other people on the road. I know that's going to happen, but oh well, I'm going to create it anyway. So because actually a lot of the time the car is going to do some good and it will transport people to the hospital and whatnot. But I'm going to create this anyway. I'm going to design it and create it anyway, and I'm going to take it to market. So you then produce this car. Lo and behold, it breaks down. It crashes. Now, 100% in our society today, you as a designer would be taken to court. You'd be like, you designed it such that would happen. You are morally culpable for this car breaking down and killing people. You'd be like, well, yeah, I did know it's going to happen. You would be had in prison. But it gets even worse, this analogy, because or worse for God, because now imagine you, Hanney, you've designed and created this car. You send it out to the marketplace, and then it crashes, and then you say, these cars that keep on crashing, I want payment for that. I want payment from you guys for the fact that these cars crashed. That's atonement. I want payment back to me for the fact that these cars that I designed and created and sent out into the world crashed.
And payment for eternity, forever.
Yeah. And that payment is an ongoing direct debit payment from now until the end of time. Yeah.
Oh, it's mad. It's absolutely insane. I mean, I don't understand why people would believe in such a thing. It's such a demeaning, horrible thing to believe in.
So at the beginning of my resurrection book, where I talk about, go into the real historical analysis of the gospel accounts and the theological analysis, I actually start the book off by doing quite a bit of philosophy and saying, right, the resurrection makes absolutely no sense if the Holy Trinity makes no sense and if the atonement makes no sense. The Holy Trinity makes no sense and atonement makes no sense. Therefore, I don't need to write the rest of this book. The resurrection is nonsensical. But let's just park these two massive problems to the side and do the gospel exegesis. So I go and do that anyway. But I start off by saying I don't need to do this because atonement and the Holy Trinity, they just make no sense.
Oh, I think vicarious redemption is immoral.
Yeah.
I mean, you're supposed to be building character. You know, they always blame it on building characters. And suppose we've got a bit of evil because that's how your character gets built. But then with vicarious redemption, it's basically saying, oh, you don't have to do a thing. You don't have to take responsibility for your actions. You just believe in this idea, and all is going to be good. And it's incredible.